Hello and welcome. My name is Tom. This is the Enthusiasm Project Season 8, Episode 3. And today, we're going to be talking about gear, equipment, gear, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot. I even have, in the video version, you can see I have a little cart next to me that has stuff on it because I needed props, even though most of this is audio only. But speaking of props, I would like to give props to our sponsor of this episode, which is Riverside.fm. Thank you, Riverside, for sponsoring today's episode. I've used it, as you might know, for several years, both as a host and a guest. And while it's always been great, as I've said before, recently I've really come to appreciate Riverside for remote podcasting and recording. And it lets you easily record studio quality remote audio and video from anywhere with no latency, so you don't have to wait and see, regardless of internet bandwidth. Riverside automatically records locally to each participant's computer and uploads it all to the cloud. This means your guests don't have to do a single thing. They don't have to lift a finger. Hopefully they don't give you the finger. And you'll get full quality isolated audio and video tracks for each person. The locally recorded files are supported up to 2160 4K video and 44.1 or 48,000 kilohertz audio, which is absolutely fantastic if you're doing a video podcast. There's even a mobile app to make things easier for you and your guests, and you can publish and share your recordings immediately or put them in your editing software of choice with separate tracks. If you'd like to give Riverside a try, use the link in the description along with promo code TOM15 for 15% off of your subscription. So thank you again to Riverside for sponsoring not just this episode, but this season of the Enthusiasm Project. 'Tis the season, this season. Now, gear. Maybe you want to use some of this gear with your Riverside calls. Let's start with the basics here. Let's start with the mic that I'm using right now, actually. This is not a new piece of gear, but definitely an update to last week's episode, basically. If you missed it, Heather and I did a live stream this past week that was really, really fun, where I did like the showdown that I had talked about between all of the microphones. It was definitely kind of a mess. In my mind, I had this idea of like how to do a bracketed, like a bracketed competition. And it all made sense to me until we were doing the stream. And then I realized, I know nothing about this. Like, I'm not a sports guy who does brackets and competition and things. And it ended up being fun. Like, luckily, people were very kind and said like, it was fun and interesting. But in terms of like adequately doing head-to-head best of the best versus best of the best, that was a little rough. But everyone got to hear the different microphones. We talked about not just the sound quality, but also the usability and the compatibility. And I was trying to find one that, as I had said before here, it's not like I'm never going to switch a microphone. I have like 30 microphones or something. Like, I'm going to switch between microphones because it's really fun. But it's nice to know that there's like the one that when you don't want to think about it or you just know it needs to work, put that one on the boom arm and get going. And I was really rooting for the Sona or the Ethos. And in a vacuum, everybody loves all of them because all the mics you're talking about were great. But the microphone that absolutely dominated everything else, every time we compared it to anything, was the one I'm using right now, same one I used last week, the Lewitt LCT 240 Pro. The other microphone that came close to it was the Neat King B2. So much so that in the live stream, we had to do that round twice because the microphones were so close together. The Neat King B2's, it's real neat. It's hard to beat. And it's hard to beat. And they're actually kind of the similar price too. The King B2 is relatively affordable. It's under $200, and the Lewitt is also like $160. But then, I have like the pop filter and shock mount setup, so it's a little more than that. I'm looking up. If you see me looking away in the video, I'm looking up at the King B. You can't really see it in the frame here. The only downside to the King B is it is huge. It is by far the heaviest microphone I have. So that makes it not super convenient to use all the time, but the sound quality is absolutely amazing. But the Lewitt, head to head against everything, just kept winning and winning, which was great. And a bunch of people said after the stream that they ended up ordering a Lewitt just because it's so affordable and it sounds so good. However, after that, we talked about some of the other things, the usability issues and things. And I ended up settling on, we crowned a winner by installing it on the boom arm, which ended up being the Ethos. Because when I was doing a side-by-side comparison between the Ethos and the Sony, I preferred my voice just a bit on the Ethos. But it was interesting having Heather there to do the competitions because her voice is so different than mine. And it was almost like flip-flop for every microphone where, I sounded better on the Ethos, she sounded better on the Sony, that kind of a thing. So it was sort of interesting. It really goes to show you how important it is to choose a microphone based on your voice and not just, what you like or what somebody else uses. And so the problem I have with the Lewitt, and like I said last week, if you saw the video, I just had it on a stand in front of me. It's hard to mount on a boom arm. It's not hard to mount on a boom arm, but it's hard if you're like me and your boom arm is kind of positioned to the side of you. Because of the shock mount, the microphone faces straight ahead. If you don't have the mic in a shock mount, you just have it in like the standard little clip thing that comes with it, you can position it more easily, but then it's like crazy susceptible to handling noise. So I think the shock mount is really important, along with a good pop filter or windscreen. And it does come with a windscreen, but I like the look of the pop filter more because it's a cool little metal grid. I don't know, it's cool. And it's magnets, clips on there with magnets. It's awesome. But anyway, that was the problem, is I can't position it comfortably. And so that was where the Ethos won out, because not only do I love the way that it sounds, but it's so easy to just use and position, because all of the Earthworks mics, if you're watching the video, I will grab the icon right now. They come with these little ball mounts so that they look small. Like if you ever bought like a camera monitor or something, it comes with a ball mount that kind of looks like the little thing that would come with that, but they're usually kind of flimsy. These are insanely strong. What is the brand? Triad Orbit ball mounts. These are insanely strong. They're super well built, and the cool part about them is they have 5/8" mounts on both sides. So they're made to put on a mic stand, and they're made specifically to mount into a microphone or a shock mount. And then it just gives you so much versatility on how you want to position your microphone. So that was why I decided to put that on the boom arm. Then last night, the very night of last, it was like Christmas Carol, except instead of being visited by ghosts and reevaluating like my worldviews, I was visited by a dream, and then I realized I was going to reevaluate my mic views, because I literally had a dream where I was doing this episode and I realized, wait, I could take the ball mount thingy from the Earthworks microphone and just put that on my boom arm, and then put the shock mount of the Lewitt into that. And now, because it's a ball mount, it can go at a 90-degree angle, so the boom arm can come in from the side and the microphone can still face me in the front. And that's what I'm using right now. The Lewitt is mounted on my boom arm, and it is facing the correct direction, and I can fine tune it as much as I want because it's on this awesome ball mount. So kind of awesome. Really wish I would have thought about that the other day. But I don't know. So anyway, I'm using the Lewitt specifically because I wanted to see if that worked. I literally woke up at like 6:30 this morning, like, I have to go try the microphone thing on the boom arm. And yeah, so that's the mic that I'm using. The other thing I'm trying out differently with the video version of this is 24 FPS, which is what I film all of my videos in. I know there's the debate of 24 versus 30. I've always used 24. They're both fine. I don't have like strong opinions or anything, but I've always used 24, so that's kind of my default. And I like the way that it looks and it works well. And I don't know, I don't have issues with anything flickering or audio not syncing or anything like that, so I like it. However, with the ATEM Mini, my original ATEM was fine at accepting everything. It didn't matter what you connected to it or different cameras, everything looked good. And then maybe like a year ago, there was a firmware update with the ATEM ISO and the original. I just installed it in both of them. And after that, 24 FPS just did not look good in anything through the ATEM. I had to switch to 30. And it was really frustrating. It didn't matter what I had the settings switched to at all. Like if I went into which is kind of, it's a little wonky how you have to go into like the ATEM software and change your frame rates and stuff. So I did that and changed it to, made sure it was 24, everything. And it still just looked really stuttery and laggy. So I even have a special memory setting on all of my cameras. If I just turn it to like custom memory 2, everything is set to 30 FPS. So whenever I stream or do a podcast, I switch the camera to that, record it at 30. However, somebody left me a comment on my video, on a video where I talked about that with the ATEM, and they were saying, no, it should definitely still be able to do 24, which I've just kind of been assuming it's sort of a problem with my ATEM and not the way that it's supposed to be, but I don't, I can easily work around it, so it's fine. But what the person recommended was in the software, instead of selecting a specific frame rate, just select auto and then let the ATEM do whatever it needs to do to make it work, even though you would think it would be the same as selecting the frame rate. I was like, sure, I'll give it a try. I tried it, and it seems, I've done a few test recordings. I'm doing it right now. It seems to work fine. So I record the podcast just straight into Ecamm. My videos I do onto SD cards so they can be full 4K and everything. But the podcast, because it's long form, it's one shot, it just goes straight into Ecamm, so it's one shot. It's easy. So this is 24 FPS, and it seems like the motion, everything looks good. It doesn't look too laggy, but I'm not monitoring frame by frame because I have to look into the lens most of the time. So anyway, that's what has changed as far as my setup here, which I'm pretty excited about. So if this works, it's great because it means I don't have to worry about flipping my camera settings around, which is always something I've messed up. A number of times I've been like a guest on somebody's stream or something, and I realized like, wait, my side looks a little laggy, and then I realized I didn't change the camera setting, and it's a whole thing, and I'm really glad that that's not a problem anymore. So that's sort of quick gear updates here. And now we can talk about camera news, which I am incredibly excited about because there has been so much in between the end of last season and now, and I haven't gotten to like talk about it to anybody, So I'm gonna talk to you about it right now, and I do want to give my disclaimer that everything I say is my own personal opinion, so it's not objective fact, and everything is great. Every camera from every company is amazing, so I don't mean to offend anybody if I give any kind of criticism towards a camera system or not. And any criticisms I give are I think very nitpicky. Like knowing everything is amazing, it's like, okay, this is why this camera is a 9.8 out of 10 and this is a 9.6 out of 10. Like everything's great, but we'll just be a little bit nitpicky here. That's kind of the approach that I'm taking. And everything really is amazing. I am excited because Nikon reached out to me, which is really funny actually. I left a stupid comment on somebody else's video. It was on one of Epos Fox's video. He did a video about the Nikon Z9 a few weeks back, and it looked great. And he was like talking about the Z9. That's kind of their flagship. It's almost like their equivalent of the maybe like the A1 from Sony or the R3 from Canon. It's sort of in that league. It's a very high-end camera, and his video looked great. And I left a comment that said, "I can't believe how good the image looks," or something dumb like that. Well, apparently Nikon saw that comment and then reached out to me via email and offered to loan me a Z9 for a few weeks or a month or something. Not to keep, but just to try it out. And I told him like, hey, I just like over the past year have switched entirely over to Sony. Like I'm sure it's amazing, but I'm not going to be switching camera systems again for my own sanity. And I'm really happy with my current camera setup. But I did tell him too that I've never used a Nikon camera, and I would love to just see a different camera system and everything. And they were like super psyched about that because that's what they said they wanted. They wanted almost like outsider feedback and that points of view from someone who's not familiar with the system at all. So that's really cool. So sometime in the next few days, I should get that camera, and then I get to have that for, I don't know, a month or two and play around with it. And I'm super excited for that because it's funny with my cameras, my FX3, A7S3, A7 IV. I have no desire to like actually get new cameras other than curiosity, which is why being able to borrow a camera from Nikon or B&H or whatever is great because I can borrow it, try it out, learn about it, but I don't have to like buy it and change my workflow or anything because my current workflow is it's perfect. Like I don't know when or why I would need to change or upgrade a camera in any time in the foreseeable future, which is a really nice feeling. And I've never felt that way in my entire life. So, but we'll talk about some things today. So that's what I wanted to get into was there have been a couple of Sony camera releases recently that have been kind of exciting for me because it's the first time that there have been like higher end Sony bodies released since I've been using the Sony system and actually kind of understand it. I got my A7S III in May of 2021, and at that time I was just choosing FX3 versus A7S III. I went with the S3 because it was less expensive, and I wanted the viewfinder just because I live in the desert. It's very bright outside most of the year, and having a viewfinder versus a screen can be very, very important sometimes. But then, as you probably know, within like 6 months, I had gotten the FX3 also. So then I just had both of them. And then the FX3 became a main camera. That's the one I'm using right now because it's it's just such a perfect camera to be like a main setup camera. And then Sony did release the A7 IV after I was already in the system, but I didn't, I had vague usage history with the A7 III. I knew a little bit about the A7 IV. I was kind of, I didn't really understand how it fit. When I was shooting Canon, I guess I still know this because I still pay attention, but I know like everything about how every Canon model fits into every other one, how each one iterates on, like it was like this weird encyclopedic knowledge, which I'm sure no matter which system you have shot with, if you've shot with one for a long time, you're probably the same way. And you just sort of know how everything fits together. And Sony was this whole foreign language where I was like, I don't know. There's 3 different A7 cameras. Then there's also an A1, and I don't know. It's confusing. So now it took a while to kind of wrap my head around all that, and now I sort of understand the lineups a little bit better, and it's been fun to sort of, oh look, I understand this camera release right now, and I sort of see the purpose, and I have thoughts about it, and that's cool because Sony has come out with the FX30, which is just starting to ship this week as I'm recording this, and the A7R5, which was just announced this past week, but it hasn't shipped yet. And the biggest takeaway between that is the fact that it is absolutely incredible that 2 of the most competitive camera companies, Sony and Canon, now have the exact same camera model, which I'm sure they hate. I mean, isn't the same? Well, they are kind of actually the competing models. I know they're different, but they both have an R5. And that is really funny because it seems kind of like a nightmare scenario in terms of, it's like Honda and Toyota both having a Corolla. But they're they are actually priced kind of the same. And they kind of have not similar features, but not dissimilar features. Like the R5 is Canon's higher resolution mirrorless full frame camera that's not the full, $6,000 option. The A7 IV is Sony's high resolution full mirrorless camera. That's not the full $6,000 option. There's quite a few differences between them, but if you look at the company's lineups, those are kind of the 2 that would line up together, and they're very similar in price as well. And that is really funny to me. They have the same, I know it's A7 R5 versus Canon R5, but point being, if somebody says, oh yeah, I have an R5, that's not clear enough to know what they're talking about. If you recommend an R5 to someone, they might not get the right camera. Like, I'm laughing at that just because I know how competitive the companies are and how they try to distinguish themselves so much. And through a series of events that was put in place years ago, they've ended up here almost unavoidably. And I've thought about this because Sony launched the A7 series in like 2014, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that, but I think it was that, almost 10 years ago. And then they have 3 models. So if you're unfamiliar with the Sony ecosystem, like I was, the A7 series, there are 3 different models. There's the A7, which now is up to the A7 IV that came out in 2021. That is like their, I don't want to call it, I guess you would call it the entry-level full frame. It's still $2,500, so I don't know if entry-level is the right word there. But it tries to be the hybrid, like it can do photo really well, it can do video really well, but it's not the best highest resolution photo camera, and it's not the best, most frame rates, most 100% reliable video camera either, but it's really good at a little bit of everything. There's the A7S, which is, the S, I believe, is supposed to stand for sensitivity, as in sensor sensitivity. So that way, it's a lower resolution camera that's geared specifically towards video, which is why I always laugh when I talk about the A7S III. And then there's always someone in the comments who's like, you shouldn't use a photo camera for video, get a real video camera. It's like, this is a video camera. I know it looks like every SLR, DSLR for years past, but like the A7S III is a video camera, way more than it's a photo camera. And then the A7R, that's the opposite. R for resolution. That is a photo first camera that also does a lot of video. And as technology improves, that window closes a little bit, but there are just certain things that you can and can't do. That Canon can't do. I'm just kidding. There are certain things you can and cannot do with high resolution sensors or low resolution sensors. So, that's just like the laws of, physics. You can't get by that. And so for a long time, at least 8 years or so, whenever Sony had the A7R, like the original one, that was kind of what they did. Here's our A7 series. We have an A7S. We have an A7R. These three cameras. And that's always been a cool thing with Sony, is because they aren't trying to make those cameras do everything. You can get the A1 if you want a camera that, I think that's a newer offering too, but that's kind of the no compromise hybrid that does everything, but it's $6,000. So, that's not in the budget of most people. If you go to the three A7 cameras, that's where it's like, they're not trying to be an all-in-one camera. You decide what you want to prioritize as the user, and then you make your decision there, or you get more than one, I guess. So you could get multiple of them get two of them for the cost of one A1. That's an A1 deal right there. And Canon has always taken sort of a different approach, where they really seemed like, if it's not the Cinema series, and it is their now mirrorless, but previously DSLR series, they really try to, like, every camera is the everything camera, and the higher you get in the lineup, they just have more features. So it's a very different approach. And that's why ultimately, as you probably know, I got frustrated with Canon, because when they're trying to put everything into every camera, you have to make those compromises. And Canon historically will always prioritize photo over video. So if you're primarily a video shooter, you can just oftentimes end up getting disappointed. Anyway, so if we look at that, so Sony, I don't know, we'll say 8 years ago. I could be wrong on that, but 8 years ago, we'll say the original A7R came out. Because it was the high resolution camera in the A7 series. And then they've iterated on that. There's A7R 2, 3, 4, and now the 5. Canon, way back in, when they started doing digital SLRs in the early 2000s, right? Like, I don't know when their first DSLR came out. I know the original 5D was like 2005-ish. And then they had their lineup. So with Canon, the way that it's worked is basically the fewer numbers and the lower the number, the higher end the camera model. So a Rebel, for example, in the United States, they're often called like the T7i, the T9i, something like that. But everywhere else in the world, they have numbers. So it'd be like the 750D, the 800D. So they're triple digit. That's their lowest end camera. And then their double digit cameras, like the 60D, 70D, well, they started at 10D and went all the way up to 90D. And then they ran out of numbers and switched to mirrorless. But that was kind of they're all of these cameras are fully capable of doing professional work, but those cameras have a little more professional features. They use like the LPE6 battery system. They're all crop sensor still, and they're just not quite as well built as the higher end cameras, but they're still really, really good. That's what most of my video production like gear for a long time in the classes I taught was 70Ds, 60Ds, and 80Ds, like, because they're just, they're not crazy expensive. They're really good cameras, and they held up to being used by high school students year after year. So that's a good endorsement for durability. And then Canon has the single digit cameras, the 5D, 6D, 1D, 7D. They're the big ones. They're made out of just solid metal. They're the super pro cameras, the most expensive ones. Pretty much that whole lineup is always full frame except for the 7D, which was their professional crop camera. And that's kind of how it's been. And then there's like 5D Mark II, 6D Mark II, 7D, they do 1DX Mark III, they do iterations of those. I guess it must have been when they hit the 90D and they're like, we have nowhere else to go. Let's switch everything to mirrorless. And that's the EOS R was a weird one because that was Canon's. I love the EOS. Actually, my EOS R is right here. I didn't mean to call you weird. I'm sorry. But this was Canon's first, other than the M series, like the M50, which I think was a nice like experiment into that. This was their first full frame mirrorless. Okay, maybe you would get this instead of a 6D or a 7D or something like that. R came out in 2018. I don't know why Canon chose R. Well, actually, I thought about this, and maybe maybe somebody knows. I don't know if Canon will ever like publicly admit why. Genuinely don't know, but I was thinking, okay, prior to that, they were using the letter D for digital because that was their digital cameras, the 70D, the 10D way back when. It's like those are the digital version. So R didn't really make sense to me. M would make sense because mirrorless, but they already had M cameras, the M50, and those are like the tiny sensor. Like it's a different lens mount, so I don't think they could use that. So then I literally went through the whole alphabet and was thinking like, okay, they can't use A because Sony took A. Some letters just don't sound good. I don't know, like a Canon B5, it sounds like vitamins or something. Then if you go down, like there's other letters like L that's taken by Leica or Z that's taken by Nikon. Like all the cool letters are kind of already taken by other companies or have other meanings outside of cameras, so it would be confusing to people. And so maybe R was just the one that like, I don't know, the shape of the letter looked the most appealing and it had the least other connotations to it or whatever. I almost think that Canon was sort of backed into a corner to do that. I guess they could have just used numbers. Like no one's going to mistake it for a film camera. So they could have just said it's the Canon 7, which sounds kind of cool, honestly. Like this is the Canon 5, not 5D, not 5R or R5, just the 5. That's sort of sweet. I don't know. That might have been what I would have opted for. But they went with R, the EOS R. And that was their like experimental mirrorless camera. And then they iterated on that and started then transitioning over their other lineups, which is why we haven't seen an R Mark II, even though this camera's 4 years old. And I don't think we ever will see one. I could be wrong. Totally could be wrong. But yeah. Then there was the RP too. I don't even know what the P stood for. Puny, because it was small, but I don't mean puny bad. I don't know. Anyway, then Canon started transitioning things over in 2020 with the R5 and the R6, which were mirrorless versions of the 5D and the 6D. The R5 is the higher end one. The 5D was the higher end full frame camera. The R6, slightly below that. The 6D was slightly below the 5D. Very similar though in body design. I would say that the R5 and R6 physically are more similar than the 5D and the 6D were. And both like professional grade and stuff. And then the weird thing Canon did was they took the 1D, made it mirrorless, and called it the R3 instead of the R1. And I think that's interesting because it leaves a spot open for a potential R1, which could be like some other. I think that was a smart move, actually. As much as I like to criticize Canon's marketing, I think that was a smart move because it leaves that spot open. Even if they don't have anything locked down for it, you have the option to release something insane and call it the R1, and that'd be the top of the line of everything. It also is the reason they couldn't have the R3. There was no 3 model before because it would have been the 3D, and that would have been confusing because people would have thought, like, is this a 3D camera? How does that work? What is that? So I think that's why the 1D became the R3 and transitioned there, which made sense to me. Then, this is what I promised, like, I think a fog descended. I started talking about cameras for like 5 hours, so I don't know if it's the same day or what. I feel like I've been going for a while, but the weird thing, oh yeah, that's right. We're tracing back to how Canon and Sony ended up with the same camera model. So for whatever reason, Canon ended up choosing R as their moniker for their mirrorless lineup, and then started transitioning their other lineups over there. They released the R5 in 2020. I do think that is where, if you can pinpoint a misstep, it would be that looking at Sony, which I'm sure they looked at their competitors, how could you not? Looking at Sony, Canon could have easily surmised, well, they have a or what is it, an A7R 1, 2, and 3, or maybe a 4 at that time. They're probably going to have a 5, which means they're going to have an A7R5. Should we actually be releasing a camera called the R5? That could be weird. I guess it's only weird. Oh no, it might even stick this way because I guess they're not on the same upgrade years. You know, cameras upgrade more slowly than like phones and stuff do, but I guess there'll be a point where they're always going to be the R. No, I guess it's only for this generation. Now that I think about it, maybe Canon was willing to make that compromise because Canon will have the R5 Mark II because they just stick with that. Well, that's what Sony does too, because the A7R is the camera. So the A7R is the equivalent to Canon's R. The 5 is their mark. Right. Okay. So Sony, the next one in like 4 years would be the A7R6, probably. And then Canon would have the R5 Mark II. So I guess that means they're only stuck in this for the next 3 years until probably Canon would be first move on from the R5 before Sony moves on from their R5. But we have this little window of time where the two competing companies, because of naming conventions put in place years, if not decades ago, currently have a camera called the R5, and that's hilarious to me. So that was a long way of just talking about the name of the camera. But let's talk about the new Sony cameras. First, I kind of have some stuff I want to dive into with the R5, but I want to talk about the FX30 first, because I think that is a very interesting camera. I'm a full frame guy. I always, from the time I got my first Canon Rebel, I wanted a full frame camera, and it seemed so impossibly out of reach that eventually in 2015, I bought the Canon 6D. And once I had full frame, I was like, this is it for me. I love the way that it looks. I love the field of view, the low light performance, the depth of field. Everything about full frame works for me. But, crop sensor, there's nothing wrong with crop sensor. And compared to anything else besides a full frame or like a medium format camera, a crop sensor is still massive. Like compared to a phone or a point and shoot or a micro four, like a crop sensor is huge. Full frame is just bigger. And I like full frame, but crop sensor does have a lot of advantages, specifically the crop. There's a reason that, and overheating too. Crop sensors are less likely to overheat. Not that it's impossible, but it's less likely because they're lower resolution. There's less happening there, so that they can be more reliable. That's less of an issue now, but early on in like the mirrorless thing, that's I think why Canon started with the M series cameras instead of jumping into full frame mirrorless. It's why the EOS R does not do full frame 4K at all. It needs to crop in order to handle it. So crop sensors have, at least for a while, had a bit more reliability and the ability to crop in. Super helpful if you're trying to do something where you want as much reach as possible, because all of your lenses by default go further than they would on a full frame camera. So if you're doing landscape, if you're doing nature, if you're doing sports, anything where you want as much reach as possible, a crop sensor makes a ton of sense. And so there are a lot of people, it's not just a stone in the upgrade path to like full frame. It is just one of many options out there. So there are plenty of professional people who use and prefer and need crop sensor over full frame. And that is important to note because Canon had been previously addressing that with the 7D, which is an amazing, there are two models of the 7D, and they're both incredible cameras. Crop sensor, professional. If you put the 7D and the 5D together next to each other, you really can't tell the difference. It's like the same body, just with it's like the FX3 and the FX30. It's the same physical camera, just with a different sensor inside. And that's really smart, because then you have people who just choose the one that they need for their specific use case. And so when Canon came out with the R5 and the R6, and then the R3, the only one missing was their crop, like their professional crop mirrorless camera. And people have been waiting for that for a long time. And we're almost mystified that it took so long. You're doing all these full frame cameras before you're doing a crop sensor camera. And then Canon finally semi-recently announced the R7 and the R10, which is interesting to me. So both of these cameras actually get really good reviews. So I think that they're great cameras. I think that their positioning is weird though, because as I just talked about, Canon's historical product positioning of the number of digits dictating where the camera falls, a single digit would put the R7 in the same class as the R5, R6, R3. Double digits would actually be creating kind of a new class of camera for the R10. But, and I don't know where they're going with this, if you look at the R10, Canon needed that. They needed a more entry-level mirrorless camera, like a Rebel, like a new mirrorless Rebel, which is kind of seems like what the R10 is. I don't know if they have another even more compact. Maybe they will, and it'll be like the R100. That, which is sort of funny because Sony has the RX100. But anyway, maybe that's what they're doing. To me, the R10 feels very much like a Rebel camera, though. That's not a bad thing. Canon needs that. Those cameras are super important. But it's weird, though, because historically, and then they just went back from 90D to 10. I'm imagining the next one will be the R20, R30, R40. That would have been the 60D, 70D, those cameras, which were they were beefier than the R10 is, and a little more on a professional level than the R10 is. So that's kind of confusing. But what's more confusing is the R7, because the R7 really is more in line with those double-digit cameras, 60D, 70D, 80D. Like, it really seems like that is the lineup that the R7 belongs to, which is a great line. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. I have no criticism of the R7. My criticism is of Canon not making an actual R7 as people expected, which should be like the R5 with a crop sensor, so that people who on a professional level need a crop sensor have a heavy duty, reliable, durable, big, tough camera body to work with, like the R5 is. And for some reason that doesn't exist. And so at least there's almost two camps. There's the people who are just checking out and, reviewing the R7, and it's a great camera. Fact, it is. But then there's the other side where it's the people who are professional crop sensor shooters, or who just want the higher end thing. You don't have to be a professional to want that. And we're waiting and waiting and waiting. And then now there's nothing there. Like, it doesn't exist anymore because there is no actual like crop R5. And that's where I think Sony made an absolutely amazing move, at least for video shooters, people who are primarily video, maybe not necessarily photo, but maybe, by just taking the FX3 and putting a crop sensor in it and calling it the FX30. Like, I think that's an amazing idea. And I think, especially for video, if you're a video person and you're waiting for Canon's like big high-end crop sensor camera, and then they basically told you that's not happening right now, at least. And then Sony's like, here you go. This is exactly the same as one of our high-end cameras, with the sensor you need. Totally makes sense, as that's going to pull a bunch of people over. And I think that was a very, very, very smart move by Sony to do the FX30, which is exactly the same as the FX3, except for the sensor. And it's half the price also, which is kind of baffling. I don't know if they're just trying to like really undercut Canon or whatever, but the FX3 is $3,800. The FX30 is $1,800. So it's even less than half the price. That's crazy. That's insane. The more they think about it, obviously prices change around the world, but no matter how you cut it, the FX30 is half the price of the FX3. It can't just be that the sensor is worth that much. It's not, actually, because the A7 IV is $2,400. Whereas I don't have my A7 IV out, but the A7 IV is $2,400. And that has a big full frame sensor. Sony even has the A7C, which is, I don't know, $1,500, something like that. That's a full frame camera as well. So pricing is very interesting there. I know it doesn't come with the audio handle. So the FX3 comes with the XLR audio handle. If you buy that separately, I think that's like $400 or $500. So if you take that out of the FX3 equation, then that would bring the FX3 down to like $3,300. But then the FX30 is $1,800. Still a pretty massive difference, with the only difference between the cameras being full frame versus crop. But I think that's a brilliant move by Sony. Like, I think it really is like, if Canon wasn't giving people what they wanted, Sony just kind of swooped in and gave them exactly what they're asking for, which I think is just super smart and super fascinating. So that's my thoughts on, I guess, the Canon releases, which are all great cameras, but baffling in how they're lining them up. It still feels like Canon's missing a high-end crop camera, and I guess maybe an entry-level mirrorless, a more entry-level, I don't know. And then Sony's releases they're doing great, like zero negative feedback there. And with the A7R5, Sony has now fully refreshed the A7 series with the A7S coming out in 2020, A7 IV coming out in 2021, and R5 coming out in 2022. So that lineup is like refreshed for at least another, I don't know when the A7S IV would come out, 2020, 2 years maybe? I don't know, that's just my guess. The only criticism there, of course, is Sony still needs to bring out like the features that they implement, the software features, and things like focus breathing compensation, focus mapping, like shutter sensor protection, different menu structure interfaces. They need to bring those to the other cameras, especially the A7S III needs a firmware update. Like the A7 IV has so many more features than the A7S III does, even though it is $1,000 cheaper. And there's no reason that most, if not all of those differences could be brought to the A7S III. That's my biggest critique there, is like your higher end cameras shouldn't have less features or get less attention than the lower end. You know, it's weird. Anyway, but I also won't argue with lower end cameras getting packed with features. That is super cool, because I love my FX3, and knowing that someone can get basically the same experience that I have on this $3,800 camera with an $1,800 camera, that is super cool. So let's talk about the R5. The A7R5, primarily a photo camera, 61 megapixels. They did go the Canon route because it has this high resolution sensor. It's like, guess what? You got 8K video. But it's supposed to be, it's been a few years now that companies have been creating 8K cameras, so reliability's there. I don't know if, I did see this morning, I got the YouTube app update where you can now pinch to zoom in on YouTube videos, which is absolutely terrifying and hilarious. But maybe that's an argument for shooting in 8K. It's an insane workflow that most people probably don't need, but it's a really good move if the camera can do it to add it in there. But you do see those limits of that sensor because it is a photo first camera. That's what it's prioritizing, which totally makes sense. Same thing with the R5. Canon just won't admit that with the R5. They're like, there's nothing wrong with the R5 at all, except Canon's marketing of it, saying that it is a hybrid. It's both for everything. And I know it has gotten significantly better over the years, but it really shouldn't take a year and a half or 2 years to get to that point. Whereas Sony's a lot more upfront about this is a camera that can do photo and video, but it's definitely going to be better at photos than video. So crazy new autofocus stuff. If you've probably seen the reviews, that's pretty awesome. It does lack, because of this sensor and how much information that is, it does lack, don't think there's any 4K 60. There's a slight crop. There might be 4K 60. There's no 4K 120 at all on it. And there's a weird assortment of frame rates and things that have crop and don't have crop, and what you can and can't do in like Super 35 mode and stuff. You still have a ton of options, and from what I've seen, other than rolling shutter, because it's such an insanely high resolution sensor, everything looks great on it and works really great on it. But the A7S III is going to perform better in video because the lower resolution sensor, the 12 megapixel sensor, is just better for 4K video. There's no rolling shutter, never overheats, has any issues like that. You can't do Super 35 crop in because there's no resolution for that. A lot of people claim that they think the image from the A7 IV looks better than the A7S III because the A7 IV is a 7K sensor being downsampled to 4K. I think that's personal opinion. I have both of those cameras, and I don't see a difference other than that the A7 IV does have rolling shutter issues and could potentially overheat. I haven't had issues with that, but obviously it's a thing that can happen with that sensor, whereas the A7S III will never overheat and has no rolling shutter issues. Same with the FX3, because the FX3 has the exact same sensor as the A7S III does. And the big thing where I kind of want to, maybe this is where, if I've been like ragging on Canon a little bit, now we can turn the tables. And I will give Canon a lot of credit where credit is due. The A7R5, the biggest physical change to that camera, which, by the way, though, before I start praising Canon, that is a photo first camera with full size HDMI. Come on. Just saying. But going back to the A7R5, the other thing is the screen. There's been this debate. It's weird because as a Canon user, Canon cameras have had flip out screens since the T3i and the 60D, which was back in like 2013-ish. Around there, their DSLRs have had flip out screens. And then all the mirrorless cameras did. Where Sony didn't. They always had the tilt screen. And then finally with like the A7S III and the cameras that followed, Sony started putting flip screens on their cameras. What's interesting to me as someone who was not part of the Sony tilt flippy screen user base where people got accustomed to that was that there are people who really, really love it. Lewis, if you're listening to this, I know your team tilt screen. Some people absolutely love their tilty screens, and it's all just personal preference. It's all just personal preference. But I think what Sony did with their R5 was pretty brilliant in that if it was like, do you want this camera to have a tilty screen or a flippy screen? Their answer was yes. And it's just both. It's a screen that tilts out, tilts down, and then also flips out and flips around. I know other cameras have done similar things, but this is the first time I've seen it done in a way like it really doesn't look like it adds bulk to the camera. And it also does look really sturdy. I haven't obviously used the camera or anything yet, but in all the videos I've watched of it, when people are moving it, moving and repositioning it around, my worry is something like that seems real fiddly and real delicate, but it seems like they've streamlined it quite a bit and also like really reinforced it. It doesn't look wobbly. It almost looks stiff as people are like moving it around, which is great. So I think that's a cool system that will probably then end up, showing up on like every future Sony camera, which is super cool. I think that's amazing. The criticism though, Sony with your monitors, what are you doing? So what I'm talking about is the quality of the actual screen itself. That was the thing. That's really my only complaint with any of my Sony cameras. My FX3, A7S III, and A7 IV, I don't know if they have the exact same LCD panels, but they seem to be the exact same. They're the exact same quality. And coming from Canon, the first thing I noticed when I turned on a Sony camera was, oh, this does not look nearly as good as a Canon camera did. Now I'm used to it and I get it. But it baffles me that these very expensive cameras, I'm holding my A7S III right now, can have like really low resolution, really color inaccurate, really tiny odd aspect ratio screens. It makes no sense to me, especially on the FX3 where there's no viewfinder. At least the A7S III has a really nice EVF, so you have a second option, but the FX3, the screen is all you got, and it's the same crummy little screen. And the reason I bring that up is because my EOS R right here, this is from 2018. This camera, I think when it was new, was like $2,200-ish at peak price. Now it's $1,500 camera. You still buy it new. It's still a good, if you need a 1080 camera, I mean, it's a great one. But it has this amazing screen on it. And all of Canon cameras have had amazing screens for just years and years now. It's not only bigger, it's the same height as the Sony screens, but it's wider. So it's in like a proper widescreen aspect ratio. It is way higher resolution and higher quality. It's more touch responsive, and it is color accurate. The colors that you're getting on this camera or on the screen are the colors you're going to get on your video file. That's been the case for all of the ones I've had so far. The Sony cameras, and I talked about this in previous podcast episodes, when I first got the A7S III, I thought something was wrong with it because the monitor is not color accurate, which could potentially be fixed in a firmware update if they just do what Blackmagic did and let you just sort of like adjust color temperature and stuff, which would be cool because you can do that on the viewfinder. You just can't do it on the screen. That seems silly. Which could be an easy fix. But the Sony screen generally looks a little bit warmer and a little bit brighter than what you're actually getting. And once you figure that out, you can adapt to it. But the reason I realized it's not my camera is I thought it was, and I actually was going to get a replacement A7S III because I thought it was an issue. And then I compared both of them and they were exactly the same. They were exactly the same and exactly as inaccurate. And so I realized, wait, I think this is just what Sony does. And so I actually started asking people, and it was funny because people who had been using Sony forever seemed to not notice it. I don't know. It was like, I think you're just used to it. But everybody who I knew who switched from Canon to Sony said that they noticed it immediately. Like, yeah, the screen is terrible. I don't understand what the deal is with that. So it's one of those things that like maybe you don't know what you got till it's gone, or maybe you don't know what you're missing if you've only ever used that. But the screens on my FX3, A7S3, and A7 IV all match perfectly. So it's not like one of them is poorly calibrated. They are all identical. And they're all just as inaccurate and it's so weird. And if they would just put like a color temperature adjustment in there, you could solve that problem pretty easily. I mean, I've gotten used to it now, so I know just like what I'm seeing on the monitor there is brighter than the actual output, and also a little bit warmer in color temperature than the actual output. So I've calibrated to it. But point being, EOS R from 2018 at, is that a train horn? And EOS R from 2018 for, I don't know, I mean, up to, well, not half the price of these cameras, but at least $1,000 less than these cameras, the A7S III, the FX3, has such a better screen. And I thought I was being crazy. And I know people also praise the A7S III's viewfinder. So I actually, if you're watching the video version, I actually have some spec sheets here that I would like to pull up. And I can also put me instead of the camera utility logo here. How do I do this? Sorry, now there I am. Hello. So now you can still see me. So what I have on screen are the spec pages for these cameras from B&H Photo. If you go to any camera listing on B&H, you can always go to specs and see everything. So the first thing I just was indulging some curiosity I had yesterday about these cameras, because when I got the A7S III, one of the things people were saying was, oh my God, the viewfinder on that camera, it's the best, it's the most amazing viewfinder. And I was like, okay, cool. And I got it and I looked through it. I was like, this is a super nice viewfinder. My EOS R, again, from 2018, also has a really nice viewfinder. I never had any complaints about it, and I didn't really notice a difference. So I was looking up yesterday, the Canon EOS R viewfinder is 3.6 million dots of resolution. It's a half-inch viewfinder, and it's 100% coverage. If I go over to the A7S III's viewfinder, it is a 9 million dot viewfinder, and it's also 0.6 inches. So it's a little bit bigger and 2.5 times the resolution of the EOS R. But yesterday I was sitting here going back and forth between them, like holding one up to my eye, the other up to my eye. I guess I just like comparing things for some reason. And I can objectively say that the A7S III is better. If you put somebody who didn't know anything about these cameras and you just showed them, here's a viewfinder, here's another viewfinder, which one do you like better? Well, I think 100% of people would choose the A7S III, and that applies to the other Sony cameras with viewfinders. So, the really, really nice EVFs. However, I think that if you took that same person, showed them the A7S III, and then like 5 minutes later, showed them the EOS R, and asked them if that were the same or different, they wouldn't know. Because while there is so much more resolution, we're talking about something that's less than an inch. The actual viewfinder screen is so tiny that the quality difference, it's almost negligible at a certain point. It was like, if you remember when 4K TVs first started coming out, a lot of people were saying, oh, I got a 4K TV, but it's like a 21-inch TV or a 32-inch TV. And it was like, actually, it doesn't, at a certain point, doesn't really matter until you start getting into a certain like size that you start noticing the differences more. I know that's a simplistic way of looking at that, but point being, the EOS R has a very, I know it like spec-wise, not as good viewfinder as the A7S III, but practical real-world use-wise, it's 95% there, honestly. But the displays, this is where I was blown away. So if I look at the EOS R, the EOS R's monitor is 3.1 inches. The A7S III's monitor is 3 inches. So the EOS R is a little bit bigger, but that's the monitor itself, not the actual panel within it, because the the part that flips out that you touch the screen, you know, if you turn the camera on or you shine the camera into a light and you can look at the screen, like the part that's the actual screen, that's what I want to look at. The EOS R is significantly bigger than the A7S III. And then the resolution. The EOS R has a 2.1 million dot resolution screen. The A7S III has a 1.4 million dot resolution. It is way lower in resolution. So it wasn't just being crazy. And if you're someone who's ever thought that, like, are these screens not as good? They are way less resolution than the Canon screens are. I don't know what the R5 is, actually. I haven't even looked that up. But my point is that this is an older camera now at a way lower price point that is outperforming all of that. So I did look up, though, because I was curious. I did look up the R5 because I wanted to know, are they just like, is Sony just throwing in these same screens? And like, do they just have like a billion of these little LCD panels and they're just going to keep throwing them out there until, you know, the end of time? So the A7R4's viewfinder is 9.4 million dots, but it's an OLED viewfinder. So that should be a little nicer than the A7S III. The monitor, though, is rated as 3.2 inches, whereas the EOS R is 3.1. But again, without having the camera here, I don't know what the actual size of the active screen area is. I don't know if what's different here. But this is something that I hadn't heard talked about. The A7R does have a resolution of 2,095,000 dots. Whereas the EOS R still has 2.1 million. So they're almost identical. Like if you can notice what, I don't know, 5,000 dots of resolution, you got pretty good eyesight. So almost the same resolution as the EOS R, just slightly less, slightly less resolution. But that is in a brand new camera being released in 2022 with a retail price of like $3,800. What is the price of the? Yeah, $3,898 is the retail price of the A7R5. And the screen is finally barely just as good as the EOS R from 2018. And I don't know about color accuracy. I'm hoping, since clearly it's a very new panel, I'm hoping that the color accuracy will be there. I want to look up the R5. I'm going to type R5 into B&H right now and see if the Sony camera comes up. It did not. So the R5 here, if we look at the R5's specs, because I'm curious what Canon did as time went on, their monitor, because this is the thing, it's almost like there was one time when I was buying my first new car. When did I get my first new car? I was 22, I think, when I got that car. It was a Toyota Corolla. And I wanted, Toyota has like, I didn't want a leather steering wheel, but I wanted like a leather steering. Toyota does good pleather, like fake leather. And I didn't want a plastic steering wheel. I wanted a leather steering wheel. And I remember one of the like car sales negotiations at one point, they were trying to talk me into this car that was almost everything I wanted, but it had a plastic steering wheel. And I was like, I don't want the plastic steering wheel. I don't want to have to put a cover on it. I don't want to like do all that. And they were almost like, why are you hung up on the steering wheel? Like there's a whole car, like you're paying attention to the steering wheel. And my answer was, yeah, that is the part of the car that I am interacting with the entire time I'm in the car. I'm touching that thing from start to finish. So it actually matters to me what it feels like and how comfortable it is. I feel the same way about your camera monitor. If you're using your camera, that is the thing, whichever one you use, if it's a monitor or viewfinder, but that's the thing that you're interacting with the camera through the whole time. I mean, unless you have, a Ninja or something attached to an external monitor, but in which case this would be a moot point. But for the most part, your camera monitor, it's the thing you're interacting with your camera with the whole time. So I'm just curious. The R5 has a 3.2 inch, 2.1 million dot. So I'm going to go ahead and guess that the R5 actually has the same screen as the EOS R. I don't know. Maybe that's just maybe Canon just did the opposite thing. Sony had like these low quality screens that they just dragged out for years past usability, whereas Canon, I don't know, invested in a whole bunch of super high quality screens that were like better than they needed to be at the time. And now they're still it's just so it's weird choices. I don't know how this stuff fascinates me. I know you can be critical and talk about it and everything, but it's also just fascinating to me. So that is the um A7R5, which also, by the way, it is worth noting, again, giving credit where credit is due, on B&H Photo right now, the Canon R5, which is $1 more expensive than the Sony R5. It's $38.99. The Sony was $38.98. So Sony is just undercutting Canon there by the dollar. The R5 has 627 reviews and full 5-star rating. So that's pretty cool. The EOS R has a 4.5-star rating, 500 reviews. Interesting. So I guess that's camera news, camera upgrade news. The last bit of gear talk. Oh, two last bits of gear talk, actually. See, this is why I'm glad I have everything sitting here so I don't forget. Speaking of cameras, I do have a camcorder on loan, which you might have seen pop up in some videos and stuff. This is the Sony PXW Z90V. This is not a new camcorder, but it is an expensive one. It's like $3,000, $3,400. B&H is letting me borrow it for a month. I didn't buy it. But it is, it's a 4K camcorder. I think it came out in 2018, 2019, but it's still the current one, and they're kind of hard to get in stock. And I asked B&H if I could borrow this because I'm curious. I just want to know how good camcorders are. I know I have all my old camcorders, and they're fun, and the form factor's nice. But I am kind of curious about, like, I know myself, for example. I like my mirrorless cameras because I like changing lenses and having super shallow depth of field, and I like the big full frame sensor. But if you don't have those specific preferences, would a camcorder really be maybe a better way to go for like YouTube and independent content creation? Because they are designed to be video cameras. There's no overheating, there's no record limits. They're video cameras to their very core in every way. And the reason I got this one specifically is because I've seen it in action on people's YouTube channels, and I like the way it looks. But it also has a very similar-ish, actually a very similar XLR top handle to the FX3. It's got 2 XLR ports and then all the controls. Plus, it actually has zoom and recording controls on it as well. And it's detachable, so you can take that off. And this camera is a little less expensive, but roughly the same price as the FX3. So that's kind of my thought. Okay, you could get the FX3 with no lens, or you could get this camcorder that has a built-in, I forget what the actual focal length of the lens on this is. It is a 9 to 111 millimeter, 9 millimeter to 111 millimeter, but it's not, I forget what the sensor size is. It's a very, very small sensor. Where I saw this camcorder, though, get used the most, it's been fascinating as I've been diving into more and more of aviation YouTube, like people who fly planes and have YouTube channels about that. It's so different because it really goes to show, I think sometimes if you're in a specific niche or you have a specific workflow, you can overlook the way that other gear can be used. And this is something I might want to talk about later. So if I end up repeating myself in a future episode, I apologize. But GoPros, for example. I can post my video on a GoPro, and people love to hate GoPros, and people can say all kinds of negative things about it. I love my GoPros. I watch aviation channels where people have, 8 GoPros mounted all over their plane, and I'm sure that there are frustrations in that workflow, but it seems like these cameras are working great and giving good results, and people using them years and years, mix and match and models, things are working great. So it's almost like when you get too in the weeds with something, you forget the greater use cases. iPads are super similar. Like the iPad mini, the iPad Air for flight and being used in flight because they are FAA approved, and all the tools on there, like you can have all of your electronic flight information on an iPad legally, complies with everything. So that's where that's where there's use for a lot of iPad models, that a lot of, like, when you just watch a straight tech channel review something, they're going to kind of have a blind spot for sometimes. And one of the aviation channels I watched is called Aviation 101. Probably the highest production value of any of the ones I have currently found. And I noticed a lot of it, because a lot of it, what the pilots will do is set up the GoPros, hit record on all of them, and then just forget about them and do all of their flight checking, pre-flight stuff, flying. Like they're not fiddling with cameras while flying, so they need the cameras just get out of the way and disappear. But what I notice is an Aviation 101, when he's in the passenger seat or not flying, he has this camcorder and gets great shots both inside the plane, outside the plane, when they're on the ground at different airports. I think uses it to do talking head stuff, and it always just looks amazing. And the zoom, the ability to just zoom in so far with a power zoom automatically, get good focus. I'm like, it's a great little like almost mini documentary style camera. And that's what led me to go, I kind of want to try out like a modern camcorder and see how good they are. So I have this one. I've used it in a few videos. It is really fun. I'm still getting the hang of it because it's so different from other things that I'm used to. But that's a really, really fun camera. So I'm checking this out, and I'll definitely be doing a video on it before I have to send it back. It is pretty cool. Like I personally wouldn't switch to that from a mirrorless camera. But the idea of having a mirrorless A camera and like this camcorder as a B camera, that could be a really smart workflow. And if you're somebody who's not interested in changing out your camera lenses or having a full frame sensor, a camcorder might be the way to go from the beginning, because it might actually save you a ton of frustration and just be so much easier to use. The other thing that I'm very excited about that I hope to be able to report back on in the near future is I pre-ordered, way back when it was announced, I pre-ordered the Tamron 20 to 40 millimeter lens, which I am very, very excited about. I've never had a Tamron lens before, and other than like the really, really old one that I inherited from my grandpa and his Canon AE1 film camera, but that's very different than it's from like the 70s, I think. So this is, they announced it in late summer, and then pre-orders finally became available like a month ago, and I finally got the shipping notification yesterday. I am super excited for that because I don't have the biggest lens lineup in the world, although it is growing. And then buying Sony E-mount specific lenses has been something, new to me. So this is going to be kind of cool. The reason I wanted that lens, the more I've been thinking about it, the more I realize it has a lot of practical application in my main channel videos and stuff. But I really wanted it as the lens that is on my A7 IV all the time, and the main lens for my second channel for vlog kind of stuff, recreational kind of stuff, because it's not cheap, but in the world of lenses, it's at $699, I think. So that's pretty affordable for a camera lens. It's a 2.8 zoom lens, so that's pretty cool. 20 to 40 is a very unique focal range. But it's really, what I was thinking I was going to do was get the 16 to 35 2.8, but it is like $2,000 and it is massive. And so it's like, I don't want to spend that much money on a lens I'm not going to use all the time. And that lens, knowing that I want that to be my take everywhere lens, 16, it's just too big for me, honestly. And so this is perfect. And I would rather have the extra reach going to 40 millimeters than the extra width going to 16. Just me personally, and what I do. 20 millimeters I think will be perfect. And 22.8, even in here, I think will actually be really useful in a lot of like talking head videos as a B camera. Maybe instead of using my 50 millimeter lens on a B camera, I can use this, and 40 might be perfect. Plus paired with this, I was going to say the 70, the A7 IV, and the ability to have Super 35 crop in, it adds even more versatility to that 20 to 40 focal length, which is so cool. So I'm really excited about that. Supposedly autofocus is going to be really good. Tamron always has these weird focal lengths. And it's funny because I don't think that this isn't like a secret, but it's not something that's advertised. But Sony is the second largest shareholder in Tamron. They own 12% of Tamron and have for quite a while. And so Tamron obviously does make lenses for other mounts too, but it's like, well, they also make a lot of Sony lenses. And the interesting part is I've seen a lot of conversations about people asking like why Tamron chooses these weird focal lengths like 17 to 28, 20 to 40. Like, why are they doing this? And it makes sense to me if you know that Sony is the second largest shareholder in the company. and then you take the Sony lens lineup and the Tamron lens lineup, and you line them up. They sort of fit like puzzle pieces. Like they don't necessarily completely overlap in a lot of ways, but they sort of fill in a lot of blanks, which is pretty interesting. And I think it's really cool because for so long, there have been so many lenses that are just, it's kind of the standards with good reason. Like there's a reason everybody has a 16 to 35, or everybody makes a 16 to 35, a 24 to 70, 24 to 105, 70 to 200. Like, you know, those are decades long, tried and true, proven, useful focal lengths for specific purposes. And, you know, and over time as a photographer or videographer, you develop your taste and your style. And when you need to upgrade your gear, you just want to keep going with the thing that you know. But it's really nice to see something kind of mix that up, like 20 to 40. As soon as I saw that, I was so excited. Plus, it's so small. My hope, I know from the videos I've seen, it has really good autofocus, which should be expected. But I'm hoping it's super quiet, because what I've been using on the A7 IV is my Sigma 24mm Canon lens adapted to Sony, and it works great, but it's kind of rough only using a prime lens for everything. And the autofocus on that lens is so loud. It's always like chittering and clicking away on the microphone. You can always hear it. And so especially if I'm just sitting down talking to the camera, it's a lot of flipping between manual focus, autofocus. My Sony 24mm G Master lens, my Zeiss Batis lens, my Sony 50mm, they're all like dead silent. They make no sound when they're focusing. And I'm assuming that this Tamron will be the same, which would be great. Plus, it's really small and really light. It's about the same size as my Sony 24mm lens. So being able to have that much power and versatility in something that is so compact, I'm so excited to just, that it's the camera that I can just, or the lens that I can put on my camera and just take anywhere and everywhere. So I think that should be here on Tuesday. I don't know. However long it takes to get from New York to California. That's how long it should be here. So that's Gear Talk. It's been a while since we had a Gear Talk episode, and I thought that would be kind of fun. So thank you for listening. As always, if you have thoughts or feedback, feel free to send them my way, tom@enthusiasmproject.com, or voice memo, or however you want. Next week's going to be episode 4, and in episode 4, I'll be doing I'll remind you that episode 5 will be a Q&A episode, and I'll be posting stuff before that. So 2 episodes from now, we'll do a Q&A, but you don't have to wait until then to send stuff. Like if you have a question or something, send it anytime. And of course, before wrapping up, I definitely want to thank Riverside.fm one more time for sponsoring this episode and this season. If you're interested in trying Riverside for yourself, use the link in the description along with promo code TOM15. I love that that's the promo code to get 15% off your subscription. So really appreciate Riverside's support. It is hugely helpful and very much needed. So with that being said, appreciate you listening to me on the Lewitt LCT 240. I hope you have a safe, happy, healthy, fun rest of your week, and I will see you next time.